The order is dated July 28, 1942. It is short, unadorned, and unmistakably urgent. The Red Army has been retreating for a year. Voronezh is burning. The road to Stalingrad is open. The oil fields of the Caucasus stand in peril. The document, signed People's Commissar of Defense I. Stalin, begins with a blunt diagnosis. Too many retreats, too many commanders who surrendered positions without a fight, too much disorder in supply and rear services. Its refrain, soon to be condensed by soldiers into a grim three-word slogan, is simple: not one step back. That phrase would acquire a life of its own. It would be quoted on propaganda posters and whispered in dugouts. It would also become a legend, sometimes distorted into a story about machine guns firing into the backs of Soviet infantry. The reality is harder to fit into a single line. Order number 227 did create penal units and blocking detachments. It did authorize shooting deserters and panic-mongers, but it also mandated fortifications, rear area order, evacuation discipline, and strict bureaucratic control of retreat routes and traffic jams that had bled the Red Army since the summer of 1941. It was a system, not a slogan. To understand why the order took the shape it did, we have to step into the summer of 1942. The Wehrmacht's case blue is unraveling the front. Whole armies have withdrawn under pressure, often chaotically, leaving warehouses of ammunition and depots of fuel to the enemy. Bridges choke with civilian carts, livestock, and stray units. The Red Army is swelling with new formations that exist on paper but lack trained cadres to keep them steady under fire. The Stadka has watched reserves disappear down roads that were supposed to lead to strong points and instead led to panic. The order speaks in sentences that are part command, part indictment. It insists that commanding officers who abandon positions without written orders from above are to be tried by military tribunals. It requires that every army create 1 to 3 blocking detachments, deployed in the most unstable sectors, to stop unauthorized withdrawals and catch stragglers. It reestablishes a strict hierarchy of responsibility. Commanders must hold. Political officers must press for discipline. Rear services must keep roads clear and supplies flowing. Local party organs must build defensive lines. The moral tone is severe. The administrative detail is striking. 2 institutions born or formalized under this order became the most controversial: penal units and blocking detachments. Penal units had existed in embryonic form earlier in the war, but Order 227 standardized them. The system divided guilt by rank. Officers who had failed in their duties or who were judged guilty of cowardice or discipline were stripped of rank and sent to penal battalions. Enlisted men and junior NCOs went to penal companies. These were not prisons in the rear. They were combat formations at the front. The mechanics were harsh and meticulous. A soldier or officer could be sent to a penal unit by a tribunal or command decision, usually for a defined period, sometimes 3 months. Sometimes until the first wound, sometimes until a specific combat distinction could be earned. In practice, one of the most common paths out was to be wounded in action, first blood, or to be recommended for restoration after a conspicuous act under fire. Commanders of penal units were regular officers, often veterans with combat credibility, who had both the authority and the obligation to record performance and, when justified, to propose redemption. Rank could be restored, decorations could be earned, but the price was exposure to very hard tasks. What did penal units actually do? They were used for missions that combined danger with urgency, probing attacks to map enemy fire, plugging gaps after a failed assault, seizing bridgeheads, clearing minefields under fire, or holding newly taken ground against counterattacks while regular formations reorganized. Their casualty rates could be severe, but the notion that they were thrown in human waves while the rest of the army stood aside is not supported by operational records. Penal companies fought alongside line units, and their losses reflected the fact that they were sent where the situation was least stable. How many men served in these units? Here the evidence is better than rumor, but still not perfectly aligned. Soviet archival tallies compiled after the war suggest that several 100,000 servicemen. Contested, commonly cited ranges fall between roughly 420,000 and 430,000, passed through penal companies and battalions between 1942 and 1945. This is a large number, but it is not the majority of the army. At most, penal troops accounted for a fraction of 1% of the Red Army's total mobilized strength at any given time. Their prominence in memory outpaces their numerical weight because their role and risks were so stark. The other institution, blocking detachments, was even more misunderstood. The order directed each field army to create small, mobile groups, typically up to a couple hundred men, positioned behind divisions likely to waver. These detachments were not meant to be permanent fixtures. They were a fire brigade against panic. Their tasks were specific: detain unauthorized retreaters, separate stragglers from deserters, send the former back to their units, and deal severely with the latter. The order explicitly empowered blocking detachments, commanders, and military tribunals to shoot panic mongers and those inciting flight on the spot. That authority is not in doubt. How often it was used is the question that separates history from myth. Archival summaries from the most critical fronts offer a picture that complicates the legend. During the hardest months of 1942, around Stalingrad in particular, blocking detachments detained large numbers of men streaming back in disorder from shattered lines. The vast majority were identified as stragglers or those separated in confusion. They were formed into march companies and sent back to their regiments or to replacement pools. A smaller share were arrested for investigation, and a smaller share still were executed for desertion, mutiny, or for spreading panic at the moment of battle. Contested but consistent in multiple reports, during the peak of the Stalingrad fighting, tens of thousands were detained. Hundreds, not tens of thousands, were executed by blocking detachments, with several thousands returned to duty. The numbers are cold. They do not minimize the violence of the policy, but they do show its main vector: return to the ranks, not mass backshooting. It is also important to distinguish who manned these detachments. Many were formed from reliable troops of the Army itself, not exclusively from the NKVD. Counterintelligence officers, first the Special Departments in 1942 and later SMERSH from spring 1943, coordinated with them, kept records, and pressed cases. In the mythology of the war, the NKVD's silhouette stands behind every infantryman. The administrative reality is more layered. The detachments were under Army military councils, worked with counterintelligence, and answered to both command and political oversight. By late 1944, as the Red Army moved onto the offensive across Eastern Europe and its cohesion improved, the need for such detachments ebbed. A specific order in the autumn of 1944 disbanded the Army blocking detachments. Control reverted to regular military police and unit commanders. The moral pressure of Order 227 was not only about punishment. It also imposed order on roads and rails, the arteries that had clotted in every retreat since the first days of Barbarossa. It required second defensive lines, fieldworks, trenches, anti-tank obstacles, so that divisions falling back did not dissolve in the open but landed on prepared bones of defense. It instructed rear services to clear routes, assign traffic priorities, and guard warehouses to prevent looting and loss. It ordered better training for new formations and the redistribution of experienced cadres so that fresh units did not shatter on first contact. In other words, the order tried to attack the friction that had made every setback catastrophic. What did this look like on the ground? Imagine a rifle division on the Don Steppe in August 1942. The German advance has punched through a neighboring sector. The division is ordered to hold a line along a shallow gully until nightfall. Behind the crest, an Army blocking detachment takes its place near the command post and the road junction, visible, not hidden. Its job is to stop the trickle that becomes a stream when a flank collapses. Couriers on motorcycles race to post signs, 2 to the brigade, 2 to the aid station, 2 to the ammo dump. Field engineers lay concertina wire to force traffic into a single lane. A political officer reads Order 227 aloud to a mixed crowd of replacements and veterans. No one likes it, but everyone understands what it is trying to prevent. When dusk finally comes and the division is authorized to withdraw by echelon, company after company files back along a marked route, while sappers blow prepared charges to deny the gully to the enemy. The blocking detachment counts men, redirects stragglers, arrests 2 deserters who tried to leave with a commandeered truck, and sends 36 separated soldiers back to their regiments. A penal company, reduced by half in 2 days of fighting, stays forward until midnight, then filters back through the line and reports to the divisional commander for tomorrow's assignment. There is steel in all of it, and bureaucracy too. In the winter that followed, at Stalingrad, the rhetoric of "not one step back" met its most literal test. Some of the harshest applications of Order 227 occurred here. Battalions ordered to hold ruins to the last man. Penal companies sent to recapture positions lost in morning counterattacks. Blocking detachments funneling the broken pieces of shattered regiments into coherent formations. Yet, paradoxically, the same system also enabled a kind of rigor. Routes were kept open for ammunition, medical evacuation corridors were policed, and marching columns were kept from colliding in the snow and darkness. Discipline could be brutal. It could also keep men alive by preventing the predictable disasters of panic. The human experience of these policies was not uniform. For some, the penal company was a death sentence. For others, it was a narrow bridge back to rank and trust. Documents record decorated ex-penal soldiers who returned to their units and commanders who wrote stern but honest appraisals that led to rehabilitation. Commanders also abused the system. A bad colonel could sweep too many into penal companies to cover his own failures. A frightened lieutenant could blame panic on his men. The paper trail includes reversals, cases where higher command restored men after reviewing circumstances. War, in other words, did not become clean because the order used clean lines. It remained human, with all the ambiguities that word implies. How did the order change over time? After the formation of SMERSH in 1943, counterintelligence procedures were formalized and, in some areas, hardened. The front stabilized and then turned into an offensive river, Kursk, the Dnieper crossings, Operation Bagration. The Red Army of late 1943 and 1944 was not the Red Army of the summer of 1942. It was more experienced. Its cadres were tougher. Its logistics, never elegant, were nonetheless more predictable. Penal units continued to exist, but their relative share in operations shrank. Blocking detachments were still used where needed, but the urgent logic of 1942 had receded. When the detachments were disbanded in late 1944, it was an administrative sign of a deeper fact. The Army no longer needed that degree of coercive bracing to keep its line. The memory of Order 227, however, did not fade. After the war, accounts diverged. Veterans of penal units sometimes described them as places of relentless attrition. Others insisted on the fairness of restoration after courage under fire. Mythmakers on all sides found uses for the story. For some, it proved the inhumanity of Soviet command. For others, it showed the iron will that was necessary to survive the war. Historians who combed the archives after the 1990s found the numbers that pulled the story back to scale. They confirmed that executions happened, that they were authorized and recorded, and that the law could be pitiless. They also documented that the primary function of blocking detachments was to detain, sort, and return men, bureaucracy with rifles, rather than to mow down their own. There is another dimension the order's legend can obscure: the link between discipline and logistics. When historians say that the Red Army learned to fight in 1942-43, they usually mean tactics, tank coordination, artillery preparation. Order 227 reminds us that a fighting army is also roads, signs, MPs, gate guards, traffic schedules, depot inventory. An unauthorized retreat was not just a moral failure, it was a practical disaster. Trucks crashed into horse carts, engineer units arrived at the wrong crossing, ammunition dumps were abandoned intact. By forcing all retreat to pass through specific gates, literal and administrative, the order tried to keep a retreat from becoming a rout. The same rigor applied to the other direction. Units were not to attack without explicit orders after the order's issuance. Commanders were not to launch ill-considered offensives that bled units white and then forced retreats. The doctrine of not one step back included, paradoxically, an injunction against reckless steps forward. What then is the truth behind the order's reputation? It is a wartime instrument forged under extreme pressure. It certainly sharpened fear as a tool, fear of a tribunal, fear of a bullet from one's own side. But it also attempted to widen the narrow margins within which the Red Army could survive the summer of 1942. It built a pathway, brutal, risky, but real, for a disgraced soldier to return. It created units whose very existence told the Army that panic would be met, caught, and redirected. It forced commanders to write orders for withdrawal before they moved a step. It forced rear area commanders to do the unglamorous work of directing traffic and guarding warehouses, so that the front could stand. And it did all this in words that leave no doubt as to their intent. There are contested edges. The total number who served in penal units is an estimate with a narrow range. The exact number shot by blocking detachments varies by source and period. What is consistent is that in the heaviest months, executions numbered in the hundreds on critical fronts and in the low thousands across the entire span of 1942-43, while the number detained and returned ran into the tens of thousands. The role of the NKVD is sometimes overstated as omnipresent. In reality, the Army Command, political organs, and counterintelligence together enforce the order. The myth of machine guns perpetually firing into Soviet backs is not supported by the record. Neither is the gentler myth that the order was merely rhetoric. It had teeth. Men felt them. If we step away from the numbers and imagine the human line one more time, the order's logic becomes clearer. A 20-year-old private who broke in his first battle and ran is stopped by a blocking detachment, put into a march company, fed, and sent back to his regiment. Another man who had stolen a truck and tried to flee is arrested. A captain whose defense collapsed after he left his post without orders is sent to a penal battalion. 3 weeks later, that battalion helps seize a bridgehead across a minor river, and the captain, wounded in the thigh, writes his report in a field hospital while his commander submits the paperwork to restore his rank. The next month, the Army disbands 2 blocking detachments and shifts their personnel to field security for an ammunition road because the line has stabilized. None of these moments makes a poster. All of them are how a huge army learned to stand up straight. By the time Soviet troops raised their banners over the ruins of Berlin, Order 227 has traveled far from the crisis that created it. Blocking detachments are gone. Penal units still exist on paper, but the war is ending. Many who once wore the stigma of a penal company have returned to their regiments, some with decorations they will show to their grandchildren, others with scars and silence. The phrase, "not one step back," remains, as phrases do, floating free of its detail. For those who care about the details, the order's truth sits in the dusty files, in tallies of detainees and returns, in tribunal rulings and reversals, in the dry notes of traffic officers who kept a bridge clear on a winter night while tanks crossed to meet the dawn. The order did not win the war. The Red Army did that with factories evacuated east, with Lend-Lease rails and boots, with new doctrines, with better radios, with millions of soldiers who learned, bled, and survived. But the order marked the moment the Soviet High Command tried to lock the front in place long enough for those other forces to take hold. It was a tourniquet, ugly, painful, and applied because the patient was bleeding out. When we strip away the myth, what remains is harder and more human. A government and an army, in the deepest crisis of the war, insisting that retreat be rare, disciplined, and controlled, punishing desertion severely, and at the same time, by the same order, building the practical scaffolding that made standing possible. It is not the story of machine guns behind the line. It is the story of a system, terrible at points, necessary at others, that kept a broken army from breaking completely, and in doing so bought time for the counterstroke that would come at Stalingrad, at Kursk, and beyond. In the end, Order 227 is neither a slogan nor a caricature. It is an administrative map of fear and duty at a desperate hour. Its lines cross at the place where states make war, in the intersection of will, organization, and human limits. And if we listen carefully to the testimony it left behind, figures, directives, and the sparse sentences of men who signed their names to them, we hear not just the command, not one step back, but the larger, quieter demand that underwrote it. Hold. Hold long enough for the line to become a wall again. Hold long enough for the army to learn. Hold long enough, finally, to take a step forward.